We will now hear the presentation of the Internet Society Canada chapter. Please introduce yourself for the record, and you may begin.
I'm Timothy Denton, Chairman of the Internet Society Canada chapter.
Matthew Gamble, Director, Internet Society Canada chapter.
Well, good morning, everybody. We hope to be entertaining and incisive. The Internet Society Canada chapter is pleased to appear before you on this issue. My name is Timothy Denton, Chairman of the Internet Society, and to my right, this right, is Matthew Gamble, Director of the Internet Society. First, a word about who we are. The Internet Society Canada chapter is a not-for-profit corporation that engages on Internet legal and policy issues to advocate for an open, accessible, and affordable Internet for Canadians. An open Internet means one in which ideas and expression can be communicated and received, except where limits have been imposed by law. An accessible Internet is one where all persons and all interests can freely access websites that span all legal forms of expression. An affordable Internet is one in which all Canadians can access Internet services at a reasonable price. We are intervening because wireless has become a ubiquitous means of reaching the Internet, and hence the quality, pricing, and availability of wireless services has enormous impacts on both business and individual users of Internet services. So for further information about our board, our activities, or our publications can be found at our site, internetsociety.ca. I would like to begin with encouraging words of a former CRTC chairman, whom you all know, on the position of every person called upon to make a decision. Make 10 decisions, 1 will be wrong, 8 will be right, 1 you win or lose on appeal. In your case, ladies and gentlemen, you have the opportunity to make a decision which may be as important as the introduction of long-distance voice competition back in the early 1990s. I don't envy you because deciding is stressful. I do envy you because you get to make the decision. You will be praised as far-sighted benefactors of the public weal and derided as fools whichever way you go. But as you were appointed to this role, and I know you will do your duty as your consciences and as the evidence guide you. You have a much more complex task than the chief executives of the firm who appear before you. Their task is to maximize profit, and they maintain a laser-like focus on it. You, on the other hand, have to balance a number of objectives, including investment, national competitiveness, affordability, and innovation. By now, you've been listening to evidence for several days, and your boredom may be exquisite. You have been buffeted by all sorts of claims of impending disaster if you allow MVNOs. You've been presented with statistics of varying credibility and quality, and you've been affronted, perhaps, by some of the claims made by various parties. Perhaps you were wishing for little red lights and buzzers with which to express your skepticism of particularly objectionable or outrageous claims, and green ones when you think the arguments you're hearing are reasonable and fact-driven. I can see it now. But we do not intend to recapitulate the arguments made by others. The basic thrust of what is being presented by one side is that Canada is not doing as well as it might in terms of pricing and levels of service adoption, and that MVNOs are a useful answer to perceived problems of market power. And on the other, that all is well, and that different arrangements constitute a threat to investment and employment, but not, we observe, profit levels, because these cannot be adjusted, as we were told last week. You have been told that Canada is too cold or too sparsely populated or for foreign approaches to competition to work. I can only recommend a look at OECD statistics for Finland or Sweden, for cold climates, or for Australia, for wireless density in sparsely occupied deserts, to see how valid such ideas are. The axiom from which we proceed is that market power is the problem, and constraining it is the task of the regulator. Other agencies and hearings have determined that certain of the large carriers have this market power, and your task is to constrain it. The question is how? In the past, and at several iterations, the federal government has sought to increase competition by granting preferential access to spectrum for new entrants of one kind or another. These efforts have failed so far. Entrants have come and gone, and for one reason or another, they have failed. So the question must be asked, do we continue the failed policies of the past, or do we try something different? Do we reinforce failure or success? I want to get at what I believe to be the principal reasons they failed, and why the model we have been pursuing guarantees further failure if we continue to pursue it. The idea that has haunted the halls of regulatory agencies, and we believe it is a bad one, is that the only real and effective competition is facilities-based. It is surprising the number of people of high intelligence who believe it and cling to it, and even the Bureau of Competition Policy is in its thrall. The truth is, as far as we're concerned, is that if facilities-based competition were the answer, we would already have it in Canada. We have plenty of facilities-based carriers, and they're all doing a good job as far as their shareholders are concerned. And I have no reason to doubt that the technical performance characteristics, statistics, are perfectly acceptable. So I want to address the first point, the belief that facilities-based competition is the real competition. Now, in my experience from both sides of this table, the biggest thing determining the outcome of regulatory hearings or any other kind of process is not the evidence, but the filters, the axioms, the beliefs through which the evidence is filtered. In this case, and for many years, the belief has been propagated that the only effective form of competition is based upon end-to-end ownership of facilities, from cell towers through backhauls to central switches. All other forms of competition are less legitimate. And facilities-based competition is the core of the idea behind the ladder of investment, another of the very large, stupid ideas that graze upon consumer surplus in the plains of the regulatorium. If you start out as an MVNO, you ought to want to become a facilities-based carrier. This, we believe, is absurd, and for several reasons. First, it is as if you said that no such things as car rental companies should exist because they don't make their own cars. To express this thought more elegantly, capitalism is a discovery process. The naughty word, capitalism. Frequently, innovation occurs not in technology, but in the property arrangements that surround the use of the technology. Think, for example, of how we buy cars in installments rather than for a lump sum. Consider Uber or Lyft or car-sharing cooperatives. These constitute innovations in property arrangements, but not really in the technology. Disapproving of MVNOs because they do not own their own radio access networks is akin to disapproving of car rental companies because they do not manufacture their own cars. MVNOs are capitalism's response to the possibilities of specialization of functions. Likewise, we do not insist there are 2 or 3 water or natural gas pipes into the house. Building facilities on top of facilities seems like a crazy way to achieve your goals. Capitalism, if allowed to function, constantly finds cheaper or more convenient ways of accomplishing desirable objectives. Often, the more effective way is not a technology, but changed arrangements of property ownership or a form of specialization of functions. MVNOs represent a changed form of ownership and a specialization of functions. The second point, we have 4. The Internet Society Canada chapter has observed that CRTC concluded that several firms exercise market power in Canada. Where we may yet differ from the Commission, we do not know, is a confidence that mandated access to MVNOs can be made to work in the interests of Canadians. Now, we know for sure that no solution is perfect. And something I'm sure you people know extremely well yourselves. We are highly conscious of the need for investment in facilities. Therefore, we are very concerned that the wholesale rates be set appropriately. We do not wish to assume away a problem. Nevertheless, we urge the Commission to summon its courage and mandate access to those wireless carriers that have been deemed to exercise market power, and I may add, no others. My colleague, Mr. Gamble, will now speak about our third and fourth points, the value created by MVNOs and the detachment of innovation from ownership in facilities.
Thank you, Tim, and good morning, Commissioners. My name is Matthew Gamble, Director of the Internet Society Canada Chapter, and I have over 20 years' experience building Internet and telecommunications services and solutions. I have two related ideas that I want to talk to you about today. The first idea is that innovation in services is what MVNOs are all about. It's not simply about lowering prices. The second is that MVNOs detach innovation from ownership of facilities. Indeed, in an Internet era, innovation has become detached from the ownership of facilities. This is known as innovation without permission, which is the revolutionary force of the Internet. The introduction of a mandated framework for full MVNO access is not simply about lowering prices for wireless services. It is an error to believe that MVNOs will offer the same thing as the incumbents in a different box, but cheaper. The value MVNOs provide to Canadians comes not from simply lowering prices, but rather from creating new, innovative services that target under or unserved market niches that are not being served by the existing players. Take, for example, a potential MVNO who signs wholesale agreements with multiple host networks. They could create a service offering which, in real time, picks the best network connection based on quality from multiple MNO host partner networks and public Wi-Fi access points. This same MVNO could also offer a seamless global roaming experience, allowing customers to pay a single price for service regardless of where they roam. On top of all of this, they could then integrate enhanced calling features, digital privacy offerings, network integration connections, and more. This is the empowerment created when we separate service delivery from the dependency on facilities. We create the ability for innovators to deploy fully virtualized communication services which are entirely distinct from the underlying facilities-based carrier. Put simply, the job of MVNOs is to fill the pipes of the larger incumbents more economically than the incumbents with market power can do for themselves. But this is not all. Their job is to find niches in which they can excel, to develop, deploy, and operate services consumers will want to use. Their primary task is innovation. If you allow the expression, innovation is their facility. Finally, the idea that MVNOs must be temporary in nature is just a reiteration in gentler terms of the axiom of facilities-based competition. It represents the same assumption that the only legitimate and effective form of competition rests in the ownership of facilities in a certain configuration. To the contrary, the Internet Society Canada Chapter says, let capitalism do its work. Let the right combination of services and facilities be discovered, not assumed, by the participants in the market. Let MVNOs create the innovative services Canadian consumers deserve. We thank you for your attention, and we are available for your questions.
Thank you.
Sorry, thank you. That was very interesting. Commissioner Levy.
Good morning. I was very taken with the examples of innovation that you feel could be unleashed. But your particular examples seemed to posit something a little bit perhaps contrary to one of your other points. You talked about building facilities on top of facilities seems like a crazy way to achieve goals and of course, spend investment dollars. But you also, as an example of innovation, talk about connecting different kinds of facility-based entities, plus Wi-Fi and so forth. So how much is enough? How much is too much?
How much time do you have to hear an answer? I'm going to let Matt handle most of this answer, but I think the first thing is that a specter hangs over telecommunications in Canada. And the specter is that there really will be a form of competition in which people can arrange what they get, where the carriers are less important and the service providers are more important. Now, carriers will tell you that they are and ought to be the only kind of service provider, and that you ought not to be able to configure what they do according to your own tastes or requirements. We believe that an internet approach to these matters is to let people configure what they get out of systems by freely rearranging by middlemen between the customers and the carriers, which we would call MVNOs. And so this, we believe, is the effective form of allowing people to configure what they can get out of all technical possibilities. All technical possibilities, not just those offered by chimneys of service providers. And the creative function of MVNOs is not just to sell things more cheaply, but to take elements of here and there and to organize it so that you get the kind of, your business, whatever, gets the solution that is best for it, not most convenient for the profit levels of the large carriers with market power. I'll let Matt go with that.
No, and just to add on to what Tim said, the level of investment that is required in facilities is exactly what is needed to produce a product that consumers want to consume. So if you need to build a bridge between two networks to deliver your service, you build that bridge. But if you don't need to build a bridge, you don't build it. So the innovation, the capital and investment required is only what is needed to deliver a product that people want.
Thank you. At paragraph 10 of your May intervention, May of last year intervention, you submitted that the retail wireless telecommunications landscape has remained essentially unchanged since our last review in 2015. And as evidence, you indicate that the national MNOs have a combined market share of 92% nationally. Other parties, Bell, for instance, argue that to get a sense of the competitive impact new entrant carriers are having on the market, one must look at their share of recent net additions. And on that basis, the regional wireless carriers perform really well, which proves they're having a measurable impact on the market. How do you respond to that?
I say I love facilities-based competition. It's just great for what it does. And if there's more of it, good. But it's not the whole solution. So that if, for example, MVNOs were allowed to exist, we would have a more creative market responses and technological responses to consumer needs. I have no objection whatever to regional players coming in. I have none whatever. Let them all flourish to the extent they can. But that's a kind of limited idea of what competition might ever consist of. And we're not in favor of a limited idea of what the competition could consist of.
Similarly, in your May intervention, you submitted that there's no evidence that the presence of new entrants has imposed any competitive discipline on the national MNOs, but would you agree that since June of last year, there have been notable price changes in the mobile wireless market, the introduction of no overage plans by some of the national MNOs, and do those recent movements give you any more cause for optimism about the state of competition?
I'll try to answer your question in two parts. First of all, we're very happy that there have been reductions of prices, and these ought to continue. We're dealing with industries that are basically, to a very considerable extent, influenced by Moore's law. There ought to be a progressive reduction of price and increase of capacity in anything that is computer-driven. The question is how are we doing relative to other countries? and apparently not so well. And without getting into a statistical war about this, because there's other people in this proceeding who have made much better and more thorough statistical, arguments, we would say we have to deal with the general tendency is that Canadian prices are relatively high and our adoption of new services relatively low. And this kind of evidence will be derided by people whose professional interest it is to deride it, but basically that's where we're at. I applaud all reductions of price and increases of service level, but we believe that they are not yet what they ought to be, and we have arrived at the conclusions we have is that a new form of competition is required.
I just wanted to add to that. Could you imagine how much better off the regional carriers would be today if they didn't have to build over the existing networks of the incumbents? For example, if you wanted to launch a regional carrier in Toronto, for example, you have to go build on top of a network that's already been built. If you could focus your capital instead in underserved areas and then leverage the underlying MNOs, the people with market power, the dominant carriers, to service the areas they've already built radios, we'd end up building much better and more efficient networks.
I have to ask, because I am particularly aware of rural and remote areas. What do you think the impact would be of full MVNO service to rural and remote? What do you think the innovation would be that might create better service for them?
So when we separate out the dependence on building a network to delivering service, it then lets people build networks far more efficiently. So as I said, instead of having to focus your capital on overbuilding our major centers over and over and over again, that capital can now be redeployed to building out rural networks. There'll be competition for these MVNO customers. There'll be people wanting their traffic. Networks will be built to carry the traffic that needs to be carried.
In your original intervention, you submitted that MVNOs are generators of investment because they incent carriers to invest in their infrastructure by increasing demand for telecommunications services. But we heard last week from TELUS and Bell, notably, that mandating wholesale MVNO access would cause them to reduce their network investments by $1 billion in the case of TELUS over the next 5 years. How do you view that claim?
Well, they're paid a lot of money to say those kinds of things, and I'm sure they believe every word they say. I've been in this game since 1979, if you can believe it, and I've heard this at every step of the way, that the floodgates of horror and communism are about to be unleashed by the CRTC if it allows more competition. In fact, a wholesale price for access ought to recover their costs, so they're not out of money. And I grant you that that is a serious and important task of setting the right price. And I don't wish to assume that it's easy or that it's perfect. So that's the first thing. But in principle, it recovers their costs. Secondly, the historical record says that no amount of the competition that might be introduced has reduced their investment, because their investment is to serve needs of customers that they perceive. And they have to stay in the game to produce investment. So, I'm trying to find a polite way to say this. I think you should observe with extreme skepticism arguments about the reduction of investment. The other thing that they constantly saying is everything can be adjusted except for profit levels. And part of the reason to believe that some of the carriers in Canada do have market power is that the profit levels are not adjusted. So obviously to Mr. Bibich, who's excellent at his job, by the way, thinks that his investor in Dusseldorf, or wherever it is, has rights to a level of profit. But that man in Germany, that investor in Germany, I can assure you has lower rates and better service, or certainly more innovative service, from European companies than you get here. And that's because they have moved to various forms of competition in their market. Of course you want to invest in Canada because it's a safe playground of protected companies. And your job is not to be the protector of their profit levels, but you have other objectives. His job is to protect his profit levels. Your job is much more complex and difficult.
What about the view that MVNOs would have disproportionate effect on regional players? Their ability to generate the kind of revenues that they need to continue to invest and improve the quality of their businesses and their networks.
As we stated in our introduction, we believe that the MVNO framework should only apply to those carriers which are found to have market power. So the regional carriers today would not be subject to a mandated MVNO framework in our view. So that means
but customers might go from using their services to the MVNOs, correct?
They may. The regional carrier, though, may also decide that it wants to offer its network on a wholesale basis to the MVNOs. As we said, the rates that they will get demand that they will get a profit out of what they invest. So if they want to build a radio network in their region and sell it to people, they're welcome to, and they probably will.
Steve, I have yeah. The job of the MVNO is to deliver customers to the carrier for a cost lower than the main carrier can procure for himself. So their job is to fill up the pipes for less cost than the main carrier, the MNO, does for itself.
What makes you think there's the extra capacity in the pipes?
Well, the job of the carrier is to produce the capacity for the anticipated traffic, and that doesn't change regardless of the nature of the customer. If I had, say, if you were wanting to serve General Motors of Canada, for example, that's a customer. But if, by contrast, you wanted to serve, I don't know, Tucal's Operation Ting, that's a customer. They are filling pipes for you, just as General Motors is filling the pipes for you. So I don't quite see what the problem is.
You have mentioned a couple of times the issue of setting the rates, and so this is probably an opportune time to ask the question. Effectively, there seem to be three options for setting the rate, the wholesale rate for the MVNOs. There's a cost-based, a retail minus, and the third is commercial negotiations with final offer arbitration as a sort of backstop. So based on your experience, your research, can you offer any thoughts on the pros and cons of each approach and which would be most appropriate in the context of the kind of full MVNO access that you are suggesting?
I wish I could be more helpful to you in this because I don't possess the certainty about the details that I might like, but that's fine. Where I don't know, I don't talk. But the first thing is that the negotiated thing is not going to happen. My experience with and the experience of people I know in the business of trying to get the carriers to, they have no incentive to arrive at a reasonable outcome. And so that leaves you with a choice between cost-based or retail minus. Cost-based is, I would say, preferable, but it might be slower to attain. And I'm now going to leave it to Matt to fill in the rest.
I just add the cost-based to us seems to be the best way to do it. It's worked for internet services, it's worked well there, and it should continue to work here. If you needed an interim rate, you could use the existing wireless roaming rates as an interim, and then backstop it retroactively to whatever the final rates may happen to be. But yes, definitely phase 2 cost plus a reasonable markup seems to be the best way to do this.
Any thoughts on what that reasonable markup might be? I think you mentioned something about 15, could be 40.
We will have made no idea what the percentages should be.
Okay.
And I don't want to get into that game. You have people for this, and we are not those people. You have mathematicians and regulators down in the bowels of the CRTC who spend their careers thinking about these problems. I applaud them for their zeal and their devotion, and I'm not at that level.
I will pass on your commendations. You submitted that Canada has much to emulate in terms of broader telecommunications policy and consumer protection from some other jurisdictions. You mentioned Finland and Sweden and Australia. You have indicated that a number of these countries provide a range of policy choices that are still unexamined by the CRTC. Can you talk a little bit more about policies and measures you think the Commission should be considering in this mobile wireless review?
I had the study that I was asked to do by the Internet Society Central in Washington is cited in our study, in our presentation, of earlier in the year. The thing that I took away from it was not any particular answer, though there's some interesting answers. It was the energy and vision with which the problem of market power was addressed in various economies. Now, the English and the Australians, I believe the New Zealanders, have gone for a national wireless backbone. Sorry, can't speak. A wireless backbone, which functions as a backbone monopoly. And I noted that over time, the United Kingdom has gone through 3 iterations of that policy. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is that, and again, I would say the same thing in relation to Japan and Korea. It wasn't any particular outcome. It's that they saw a problem in certain periods of economic distress, or they saw a problem that the new entrants were not working, and they just boldly interfered in the market to straighten it out. And this happened in Korea and after an economic crunch. It happened in England through a process of deciding how they would work out their access prices. But well, I do encourage, because I recall, and this is sort of a mea culpa, I recall when I was at a commissioner, we didn't much look at foreign jurisdictions. And yet, the problem of constraining market power is the job that the legislation has assigned for you to deal with. And other jurisdictions have been quite energetic and interventionist in dealing with these things. And when the interventions didn't work, they tried something different. And they didn't take 20 years to do it. They did it in 2 or 3. So the message I would seek to relay to you is not any particular outcome, though these could be discussed. What really is important is that the national policy apparatus, both dealt with these problems of constraining market power in quite energetic interventions to constrain it. And that's where the solutions vary by country. The solutions probably will vary by political and economic culture. But that the overall impression I got was that the relative to other countries, advanced economies, Canada has had a long period of stasis or accepting the status quo of the basic relationships of carriers to government to regulator, and that others have been more interventionist, and when they have intervened and it hasn't worked, they've changed it within 2 or 3 years. So that was my big takeaway from looking at both North Asian, Australian, Commonwealth, and other countries, and European ones, was just that. And I will not dilate further about it, but take courage. Other people have faced these problems.
We have had several conversations here. Several interveners have talked about the issue of providing what is now pretty much an essential service to all Canadians, and the issue of mandated low-cost plans is what I'm getting at. Some parties, for instance, TELUS, mentioned last week that the issue of poverty goes beyond the price of mobile wireless services and is more an issue about affordability of basic necessities in general, and solutions are best addressed by government social policies aimed at reducing poverty. What are your views on that matter?
I stay away from it like a hot electric fence. We have no particular wisdom to offer on this subject. I have no job or lifetime experience in it. All I know is that when the effective competition is introduced, as it was in the long-distance case way back when, all income quintiles made larger uses of telephony, and all income quintiles benefited. So the thing that is really needed is lower prices. And beyond that, I just don't have any desire to engage in special programs or special qualifications or a heavy or light bureaucratic regulation of how we provide services to the poor. That's not my game.
Let's talk a little bit about facilities-based competition, which you characterize more as faith-based competition. So I take it, I take your approach. Some parties have argued that Quebec, which has a strong fourth facilities-based carrier and lower prices than anywhere else in the country, is evidence of the success of facilities-based competition. How do you respond to those arguments?
Well, I think they're wonderful. I have no problem with facilities-based competition. I just think it can be an inefficient way to achieve particular goals. And I do believe that MVNOs provide ways of getting services out of a configuration of physical facilities in a way which places the burden on the MVNO to deliver something innovative and useful to customers that puts them under a pressure to do so, or else they're just out of the market or resellers, and they're basically there's some interest to produce lower prices, but the real thing is the innovation in the configuration of physical facilities. And that doesn't come from lawyers. That comes from businessmen and engineers. So just as the internet provided new ways of using physical facilities to transport electrons and photons, so this logic, we seek to have it applied in carriers. And when I say that carriers are still the sort of last bastions of you get what we deliver, and this idea of MVNOs is to separate the carriage of signals from the configuration of commercial services that might be derived from those particular facilities. And I would suspect that this kind of idea is what they deeply fear. They weren't here, in a mode of peace and love. They were here because I think they understand it. MVNOs promise a configuration of services that may actually be innovative and may actually produce unforeseen benefits. And it opens up their universe, which they control pretty nicely, to outside forces and outside influences that can reconfigure what people get out of our networks. So we don't have the answer as to what those particular reconfigurations are going to be. People with money, guts, capital, brains, engineering, and technological skills will provide them. But we can at least, I believe, open the door to that kind of innovation through what you decide here in the next few weeks.
You have You've discussed before how mandated wholesale access could drive network investment, but we have heard from several that if there was mandated MVNO access, that it might influence a carrier's decision on whether or not to purchase spectrum, if it knew that it had to share with an MVNO who had assumed no risk for that spectrum. How do you feel about that argument?
That may be the case, but some other actor will come along, buy that spectrum, and provide the radio access. With a phase 2 cost plus markup option, there's a guaranteed return on your investment. You will get your costs, you will get your markup, you will make money. Therefore, if no one wants to service an area, none of the existing players want to service an area, a newer entrant that we haven't even heard of yet, who may be just a radio access network and not a carrier of themselves, may come into existence who buys that spectrum, provides that access, and makes their profit by doing that part of specialization rather than doing the full stack.
What about the argument that ultimately some of the costs of investment, the cost of capital and so forth, might become more expensive as a result of mandated MVNOs, and that it's the consumer who would end up paying for this so-called experiment.
I'm really quite at a loss by that question. There will be experiments. Some things will get more expensive. But mostly, we're in an industry which is driven downward in pricing by the operation of Moore's Law and a few other things that work that make everything computational cheaper. I have trouble understanding what the premises of that question are. I don't know how it would occur. It might. I deny nothing, but I just don't know how it can occur.
Well, the argument is that the cost of capital might go up because people would become risk averse, and that therefore the cost of running networks and so forth would go up, and the only person who ends up paying in the end is the consumer.
Well, that happens under any conceivable arrangement of facilities and entrepreneurship, is that the customer always ends up the person paying. So it has been, I believe, shown in other countries that, you know, MVNOs and more competition, whether facilities-based or non-facilities-based, has a tendency to lower prices. Look, just to get back to reality here for a moment, we're not doing that well. We think we're doing okay because we're, you know, we can, but if we look at how other countries are doing, we have much higher prices and much lower rates of adoption. So let's start at those large, brutal facts and then worry about cost of capital or other things as time goes by. But the real thing is to address the problem of market power, which is the ability to sustain higher than normal prices. Because you have market power, you can do it. And so that if you reduce market power, the whole system ought to go to lower prices. And beyond that, I don't know.
You've said that there should be no investment obligations for MVNOs. Is that correct?
Yes.
If we went down that road, what's your take on the Bureau's model where MVNO access would be able to would be available to strong regional competitors only?
I'll let Matt handle most of this answer, but I believe that the Bureau of Competition Policy is still in the thrall of extreme reluctance to allow MVNOs and an normative view that all competition must, in truth, real competition, the kinds that's really effective, you know, growl your voice here, that's facilities-based, and all the rest is just highfalutin nonsense. And obviously, we are not of that school of opinion.
That's great. Yeah, this continues to presume that there is only one way to do things, which is I build a network end to end and I put customers on it, and that there's no specialization of functions. I believe that as we move down this path, as 5G rolls out, as other things happen, the specialization of functions is inevitable. We will start to see people who specialize in building radio access networks. There are people who specialize in building the core network side. There are people who specialize in services that run on top of that. This is what happened in the internet era. At first, everyone tried to do everything, and if you try to do everything, you're good at nothing. So people start to specialize in what they do, and in the internet space, we have people who provide backbone, and people who provide last mile, and people who provide services. It's not one company that provides the entire internet. It's a series of players working together, building on top of one another that creates services. Wireless should be no exception to that.
Have you examined Cogeco's model at all? Do you have any comments on that? It would permit certain wireline carriers to enter the market as MVNOs.
It seems great if you're Cogeco. Otherwise, the model doesn't seem to do much more than enrich existing players. It doesn't do anything for the innovative players out there who are doing things in the internet space, and it favors people who have a specific configuration of facilities today to further their entrenchment in the market.
Well said. Don't let your commission become the Society for the Protection of Semi-Obsolescent Industrial Structures. Please.
If we decided to go that route in any case, what would be the reasonable metric to use for assessing investment if investment obligations were supposed to be imposed? Do you think it would be number of subscribers, network coverage, spectrum assets?
I think in the words of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the senior, the greater, I do not accept the premises of that question.
Fair enough. In your submission, and you have alluded to it before, to the European experience, and to, I think that you said that the primary thing that you took away was the vision and the willingness to intervene in the market that you took away as a specific innovation in the European experience. But is there anything else specific that's being done in other jurisdictions, whether it's Europe or anywhere else, that we should consider as we deliberate on this process?
Well, it's outside the boundaries of this proceeding, but you know, both England and Australia, and I think New Zealand, have experimented with national broadband networks, which have their own problems of being monopolies from which everyone derives services. And when Elliot Noss recalled the incidence of the example of Stockab, which is a fiber supplier in Stockholm, you know, upon which 4 cable companies or a whole bunch of, you know, telecom companies operate, that's a model that this country has definitely not adopted. Again, my views about what you might want to do is don't look at foreign countries as if they were weird. They've got the same problems that you guys have. How do you constrain market power, and how do you do it right? And there's various examples you can follow or not follow. But I would not do as perhaps we did in my time there, sort of saying, well, you know, foreign countries, whatever. I would look to, there's other examples of people in jurisdictions of seriously important economic powers who have had to deal with the problem of a residual market power of the former telecom everything monopoly, which we don't have here because we had 2 infrastructures, one built up for telephone, the other built up for cable. But they had seriously important problems of market power and how to adjust for them. And they've had various ways of dealing with it. The point is, it's normal to look at other countries as if they might actually have something to say to how we can solve our problems, and not to deride or denigrate other foreign solutions because they happen to be foreign or weird or not ours or whatever. The problems of managing and regulating telecommunications enterprises are global. They have certain kind of universal features, seemingly of market power, and solutions to that market power have been various. Among them have been MVNOs. And when you look at facilities-based competition itself, there seems to be a tendency for the facilities-based competitors to merge and collapse from 4 to 3 and 3 to 2. So you're faced with ever-increasing concentrations of power in certain carriers. And so where are you going to get the competition? Well, the answer for the internet was, of course, to say competition is in the applications and competition is in different places than in the physical substructure. I don't think you're ever going to get much competition, or should get all that much competition, in the backhoe and conduit business. It's in the switching and the things that are affected by computers and communications that the competition should exist. And the claim of facilities-based competition is to say, no, this revolution of things should not exist because we know best and you're interfering with our profits. I don't think these are adequate justifications for maintaining this kind of technological business arrangement.
Thank you very much for your presentation and your fulsome answers.
Thank you. Just a couple of quick follow-ups. One, I do have to say I disagree with your characterization that the Commission does not look at international examples. That's certainly not the experience under my tenure and not my experience as a former staff person. So we'll leave that where it is.
All right.
2 quick questions. 5G.
Yes.
I assume that you accept that there are significant investment requirements associated with its deployment.
Yes.
And how does that work under your model? I assume it will be the facilities-based providers that will fulfill that obligation to build out.
Well, 5G is, so far as I understand it, is characterized by higher frequency radio lengths, therefore in the gigahertz, therefore shorter radii, therefore more need for devices to be placed in more frequent density of devices. If that is what 5G is, I'm not sure I see whether there's any particular difference in kind between what we have now and what we will have under 5G. You have promises, but we don't necessarily have a different, in principle, we still have devices, radio, backhauls, and the apparatus. Imagine if we'd started at higher frequencies and had gone the other direction. So we'd started at these very high gigahertz frequencies and now gone to broader frequencies that are like to the horizon. I don't see that the arguments are fundamentally affected. I'm open to argument on this. I don't have all the wisdom of the world on this. I just don't see what the big deal is.
I think the issue, there may be other factors, but one of the issues certainly is the magnitude of the investment. In your proposal, would MVNO-based operators have access to 5G?
Well, I think they should if the underlying carriers have market power, yes.
Okay, thank you. And then last question, what about cybersecurity concerns?
These are huge, but I think they're outside the realm of anything we are prepared to speak upon. I mean, if there's going to be a hearing on cybersecurity, absolutely. I just do not have preparation or wisdom on this issue. And it's non-trivial question is a huge question, but it's another hearing, even if it is within the jurisdiction of this body.
Thank you. Last question. You mentioned anybody with market power and referred specifically to the three national players.
Well, wiser minds than ours have determined who has market power, and I believe it does include those three national players.
I think the issue of a determination is in our hands. There have been requests and different views with respect to Saskatchewan. Do you have a view as to whether or not SaskTel has market power and whether or not they should be required, whether mandated MVNOs should be required in their territory?
None whatsoever.
Thank you. Thank you for your submissions and your responses.